Nishikawa-san. It's a real honor for me to be a part of this new series, and it's a very impressive program that you have. So I appreciate the opportunity. We started the Next Alliance initiative at Sasakawa, USA in the fall of 2021 to support bilateral dialogue on new and emerging challenges that the Alliance faces. We organize one project each year in the foreign and security policy area. And in this area, we've been focusing on the modernization of U.S.-Japan command and control relationships as Japan develops a new joint operational command for the self-defense forces and introduces counter-strike capabilities. And so the U.S. should be updating its own command relationships with U.S. forces Japan. And we've been convening dialogues on that front. And then we organized one project in the area of technology and innovation. And for the last 2 years, we've been focusing on economic security. And we've been able to track the early stages of the core partnership, the Japan-U.S. Commercial and Industrial Partnership, or JUSIP, and the creation of the Japan-U.S. Economic Policy Consultative Committee, or EPCC, or Economic 2+2. Interestingly, the first core partnership fact sheet and joint statement, leader's statement from April 2021 mentions the word security about 25 times between the two documents, but the term economic security does not appear once. Instead, it mentions cybersecurity, health security, shared security, and good old peace and security. But by the time the Commerce Department and METI launched JUSIP in November 2021, we first see the line working through JUSIP to strengthen the competitiveness, resiliency, and security of both economies. Now, of course, the term economic security is everywhere. And in the U.S. especially, it covers an extremely wide range of topics, and almost all related to China. And because the China factor is so central to U.S. thinking about economic security measures, I'd like to start today just by briefly highlighting how U.S. policy and strategy vis-a-vis China has evolved in recent history and how it's viewed today. Because I don't think it's as straightforward as sometimes it's portrayed. That is that we tried to make China a responsible stakeholder in the world, but it didn't work. So the U.S. has had a few pivotal China policy, geopolitical strategy debates during the 20th century, such as the effort to support Chiang Kai-shek and the Chinese nationalist movement in the 1940s, President Nixon's decision to switch U.S. recognition of China to the People's Republic of China in the 1970s, and the pursuit of what some call deep integration with China via normalized trade relations and China's entry into the World Trade Organization at the end of the 1990s. Interestingly, the same Clinton administration that effectively pushed deep integration with China and NAFTA across the finish line was also the first to propose an Economic Security Council in the White House. This eventually became the National Economic Council to help bolster U.S. competitiveness. That was the focus, competitiveness. As an aside, the first substantive mention I've seen of economic security in the United States goes back to 1935, when President Roosevelt submitted an economic security bill to Congress that eventually became the Social Security Act. So you can see that economic security at that stage was about personal security and economic protection at a personal level. So it's interesting to see how this term evolves in the U.S. But in the 1990s, the focus for economic security was on strengthening U.S. competitiveness, even including deficit reduction. So promoting free trade, getting closer economically with China, and strengthening economic security in that era were not mutually exclusive. They were all part of the strategy. Today, however, it's very different, with a closer connection to national security, even national survival, and the debate between de-risking our economic relationship with China to strategic decoupling, which some are advocating in Washington today. So this is now the debate that's going on in Washington. Before, with deep integration, it really only took about a decade for that concept to fall apart, or begin to fall apart. But the progression of this deterioration is useful to consider. The first problem was political. Retroactive studies of that time estimate that new trade and investment patterns that were created with China as a result of these changes resulted in nearly 1 million manufacturing job losses in the United States from 1999 to 2001, so 3 years. Advances in automation and the Great Recession, of course, added to the China factor, to the point where just one state in Ohio, for example, 400,000 manufacturing jobs were lost. Now, as a nation overall, it was not a net negative economically. The overall economy was okay. But for those states and those communities, it was a big problem. And the finger pointed at China, and politicians noticed. So then more scrutiny of Chinese trade practices in the next decade coincided with growing disappointment in China among U.S. Private sector members, who became much more critical of persistent market barriers, intellectual property theft, Chinese subsidies to domestic firms. And thus, the biggest cheerleader, or U.S. cheerleader for deep integration, stopped being so vocal right around 2015, when Beijing launched Made in China 2025 and its civil military fusion initiatives. So as a result, we added an economic layer. Now the economic piece was becoming more prominent, and a military security layer was placed on top of this political layer of disenchantment with China. More recently, the emergence of digital authoritarianism, worries, and China's Digital Silk Road initiative have added one last layer, an ideological layer, whereby China can leverage countries around the world in ways China can leverage combinations of technology, finance, and infrastructure support for countries around the world in ways that will undermine democratic norms and human rights. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in the United States referenced this just 3 weeks ago in Davos at a speech he gave, that we are in stiff competition with China about the type of world we want to build. And it comes at a time of disruptive technological change. So, to some extent, U.S. policymakers focus on different aspects of economic security when it comes to China, and that makes a difference. Those with a national security priority, mostly Republicans, but some Democrats too, want U.S. companies to succeed and help maintain a military advantage over China. But proposals in Congress to provide government subsidies to big U.S. tech firms is seen as corporate welfare by liberal Democrats who prioritize the domestic condition, almost the competitiveness in a way, but at a personal level, at a labor level, education, healthcare, support for the middle class. That becomes their economic security agenda. These different layers, political, economic, military, ideological, complicate strategy formulation, the policy response, and alliance coordination. So, as a result, U.S. economic security policy is fragmented, often stovepiped, despite a deliberate effort by the Biden administration to leverage the NSC as an interagency coordinator on economic security and China policy at the same time. So there are three main points I'd like to make today regarding recent trends in the U.S. on economic security. And this is the first one, that there is growing recognition that our current approach to managing economic security is insufficient. I'll get back to the other two later, but here are a few relevant reports and articles with the China Select Committee, for example, calling for the creation, this is in the House of Representatives, calling for the creation of a coordinating office responsible for assessing and developing an economic security strategy and devising a plan for how to respond to China's economic coercion. The model they point to in the Select Committee is in a bill that was recently introduced, H.R. 5703, or known as the SHIELD Act, and it has a plan for an Office of Economic Security, Preparedness, and Resilience, and under it, a supply chain mapping unit that would help assess the supply chains in different areas. There's another proposal in Congress called the Global Technology Leadership Act, which is trying to support the creation of an Office of Technology Net Assessment. So this issue of mapping and assessing the threats on the economic security front, the risk assessment is seen as a very important area to focus on, not just in the defense area, but in this economic security area as well. But who does that work and how it gets carried out is still being debated. Right now, it's being handled in various departments and offices kind of in a diverse way, or not necessarily a coordinated way. But this is an area that the U.S. and Japan, I think, can collaborate quite significantly. Now, some scholars recently in Foreign Affairs magazine wrote an article that called for nothing less than a transformation of the U.S. government is required to deal with economic security issues. And Japan is actually mentioned as an example of a considerably, this is quote, a considerably reformed economic security state because of the economic security legislation and some other steps that you've taken. It also, this article calls for a reworking of the Defense Production Act, Export Control Act, and other changes to keep up with the demands on the economic security front. And there are other proposals in Congress and announced by the Treasury Department recently to further strengthen or expand the powers or add resources to the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, or to build upon the Export Control Act, Export Control Reform Act of 2018 with a wider coverage, including the use of foreign direct product rules. Now, regarding CFIUS, policymakers are noticing that in 2022, CFIUS set records for the highest number of withdrawal refiles. This is one area where they would, because it takes too long to assess, they require the filer to withdraw within the 90-day window and then refile again because it's the amount of time it's taking to carry this through. Also, the most mitigation agreements, where CFIUS requires certain adjustments to the plan for it to be approved, and the most notices requested for transactions that were originally filed as declarations. This is meaning someone is declaring and trying to see if they need to actually file a notice, and yes, indeed, CFIUS is requiring more and more formal filings, where in the past, perhaps they would just decline and say, we don't need to review that. This is all despite a drop in Chinese transactions overall. Now, the second point on my list of 3 trends to watch is a diversifying definition of economic security, or economic security proliferation in the United States. The scope of what is considered to be economic security policy is still expanding. Cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, including AI security or dealing with adversarial AI, countering disinformation, and data governance are being added to the traditional list of countering economic coercion, supply chain diversification in all these different types of industry areas, critical minerals, space, agriculture, et cetera. Even down to the de minimis rule of $800, of an $800 import exemption per day with minimal paperwork filing requirements and tracking ability. So congressmen and bureaucrats are beginning to see Amazon packages coming over from China valued at less than $800 as an economic security threat because they don't know what's in there and the requirements are different. So there's some people who are pushing to lower the de minimis rule on that front. And then we still have all the efforts in economic security to promote research and development for emerging tech. So this is going to really complicate the ability, the first point, which is trying to rework the structure in Washington for how to manage cybersecurity. And I'd like to highlight artificial intelligence, data, and cybersecurity in particular as being a focus of economic security, because I see a potential gap emerging between the United States and Japan in terms of how we're framing future regulatory approaches, despite efforts to harmonize this at the G7 and OECD levels. I've seen discussions at congressional hearings and talking to friends at the Department of Homeland Security, for example, and Commerce, that suggest an interest in more of a supply chain management approach to data, tracking ability, accountability, et cetera. They would leverage existing mechanisms, like in the Commerce Department, their Office of Information and Communications Technology and Services, or OICTS, and the Federal Acquisition Security Council, which is a cross-department agency council to enforce higher standards or exclusions for Chinese components in IT or telecom products, requiring exporters to prove that their products meet those standards. So I think we will see rules that significantly hinder the U.S. operation of businesses like TikTok by ByteDance, and in the AI space, protections against the poisoning of AI model development, cloud certifications, and accountability rules, and other AI standards that go beyond what I think is being explored currently in the current AI dialogue between NIST and METI's Information Technology Promotion Agency, for example. Now, the third point, the third trend to watch relates to the widening gap within the United States about how serious is the economic security threat and what we should do about it. Everybody thinks it's serious, but there is a gap that's developing. And this is something of a Trump-Biden split at the moment. Trump-supporting Republicans are at the farther edge of this spectrum. I mentioned about Robert Lighthizer call. He was testifying on Capitol Hill, the former U.S. Trade Representative during the Trump administration, called for strategic decoupling with China. And his recommendations include withdrawing China's permanent normal trading relations status and creating a whole new tariff schedule, tariff regime for China. And this is because, in his view, and this is a quote, "The Chinese government runs the most comprehensive suite of mercantilist policies in global history." And he also said that all companies in China, whether or not they are formally state-owned, exist to advance the economic modernization goals of the Chinese government. So there's not much room for what the Biden administration would argue is trying to allow the vast majority of economic trade and engagement with China to continue and only focus on a tiny amount. Former Trump Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said recently that the Chinese Communist Party has been at war with the U.S. economy for the last 20 years. And in a recent congressional hearing, he pushed for more sanctions on China and more active enforcement to close loopholes for the CCP, for the Communist Party, and for other countries engaged with them. In a Trump presidency, therefore, I think the whole concept of what constitutes a small yard and a high fence could change significantly, with a wider range of economic activity included. And I suppose I've heard some friends worried that maybe a Trump administration would try to cut a deal with China to essentially limit U.S. pushback in East Asia in exchange for various trade and economic security concessions with China. But I think this is highly unlikely because of this sense of being at economic war with China among some who would join a Trump administration. Now, on the other side, as I mentioned, the Biden team sees itself as clear-eyed to the Chinese economic security threat, but believes it can reassure China that the bulk of economic engagement can continue, even if some high-end technology trade and investment is interrupted. Republicans call this naive, while many Democrats and some Republicans think it's a pragmatic way forward. Both sides actually give lip service or mention the idea of coordinating with allies and partners as being an important part of this. But this is obviously easier said than done, depending on which strategy you're approaching. So in Davos 3 weeks ago, Jake Sullivan described it as entering a new era, quote, marked by a simple thing to say but a very complex reality, which is strategic competition in an age of interdependence, end of quote. So the main conundrum or the main challenge in this situation is how to compete effectively without harming yourself or your friends and undermining the open, stable system that we all benefit from. So both sides have been exploring the potential implications and options if an actual economic battle or confrontation were to break out. For some in the Trump administration, in the Trump faction, one can imagine this starting from the back and forth application of sanctions, stemming from a U.S. initiation of strategic decoupling. The Biden team, however, thinks that in peacetime, this kind of economic confrontation can be avoided if U.S. economic security measures are truly limited to the most necessary technologies and supply chains. But of course, if a conflict involving Taiwan breaks out, then even the Democrats would look to apply economic pressure and costs on China, similar to the Russia-Ukraine situation. So again, this issue of assessing risks and assessing threats is critical to understanding how this could unfold. A friend of mine who was running a war game on Taiwan blockade, so it was an economic war game. This has been done by MIT most recently, is looking at situations where, for example, an effort to resupply Taiwan during an embargo or some kind of quarantine, a blockade, probably Taiwan ships would be running like a shuttle service almost. So foreign ships may not be entering and going directly to Taiwan, but there would be another transshipment point where goods would go off of the international carriers onto Taiwan ships and then into Taiwan. We've seen now in the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels missile shots at cargo ships, raising the insurance rates, creating a war risk insurance dilemma for the countries or the shipping companies that have the largest, most expensive ships. Those are the ones that are paying now almost 7 to 10 basis points more in insurance on the value of their ship and the value of their cargo. So that is what's driving the rerouting in that case. So let me go through some of the tools that these games are looking at, how the U.S. would try to engage or, in their minds, discourage China from or deter China or de-escalate an economic conflict. Of course, the problem is usually it creates more escalation. But some of these tools, there are primary financial sanctions, the specially designated nationals SDN list that the Treasury Department controls through the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and a less severe variant related to Chinese military industrial complex. Secondary sanctions that would be applied to other countries that then engage with these designated Chinese entities. SWIFT banking-related measures, freezing of assets, and preventing profit repatriation of profits back to the home country. These are all considered potential tools. There are tariff measures, Section 232, that are justified on national security grounds, Section 301 justified on unfair trade practice grounds. These are all paid, of course, by the importer, which candidate Trump and President Trump never seemed to really understand in terms of who was actually paying for these. Non-tariff measures, quotas, inspections, additional custom procedures, and of course export restrictions and the like. And the use of the foreign direct product rule, which has come up now, it's been applied in a semiconductor context, but we'll see whether or not this expands into other technology areas. There's discussion, but there's no real concrete movement on that front. So I think policymakers need to be very careful. After all, the U.S. and China account for approximately 40% of global GDP. The United States is China's primary trading partner, and China ranks just behind Mexico as America's second largest partner, with U.S. imports from the PRC reaching an unprecedented $563 billion in 2022. And this economic interdependence extends to the PRC's substantial holdings of U.S. debt, totaling about $860 billion, making it one of the U.S.'s largest creditors. So this decoupling rhetoric is dangerous, in my opinion, and I think a more tailored de-risking strategy is more appropriate and more manageable to work in coordination with allies. Now, in terms of working together with allies, whether it's in peacetime or in the event of some kind of kinetic decoupling, many are quick to emphasize the need to develop joint plans and coordinate with allies and partners. At the moment, we're using various mechanisms to try to harmonize everything, from export control policy to supply chain resiliency to quantum computing innovation. With the EU, we have the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which is a 3+3 approach with USTR involved. With India and South Korea, we have NSC-led forums, primarily focused on new and emerging technologies, critical technologies. With Israel, it's an NSC-led, but there's a much larger role for the State Department in this case compared to India and South Korea. And then, of course, with Japan, we have the EPCC, which I think is a big improvement from where we were before, but I think it's not quite reaching its full potential because so far the 2+2 framework is viewed as a way to coordinate the policies of the 4 ministries, or the 2 departments and 2 ministries. In reality, it should be a mechanism for coordinating our 2 governments' approach to economic security overall. So it's not quite demonstrating or encouraging other stakeholders to think that the EPCC is their way to influence policymaking and to benefit them. So with outbound investment restrictions, for example, when Treasury was working on that issue, they coordinated, I think, with the Ministry of Finance to some degree, but it was very hard for the Foreign Ministry to have insight into what Treasury was doing because it was not coordinated within the EPCC or even just fully informed, even though any outbound investment restrictions that the U.S. applies to China would have very important diplomatic consequences in a U.S.-Japan context, but also with Europe. So it's really hard for my embassy friends, my Japanese embassy friends in Washington, to understand how the U.S. government is going to reconcile all these different competing economic security policy efforts, balancing Congress, business interests, the various departments and stakeholders. So I'd like to see the EPCC develop a way to manage that. I have not talked much about the technology promotion side of economic security, which adds more complexity. And I just wanted to mention, I went backwards instead. There we go. So just last week, for example, the White House announced 10 regions in the United States that will receive $530 million in grants, so $500 million, and matching grants and matching funds as part of the National Science Foundation's Regional Innovation Engines program. This was authorized by the CHIPS and Science Act. And this one program, which looks to invest and develop in these regional innovation hubs around the country, involves all of these departments and agencies and more that I couldn't list to make it readable on the slide. So I think it's impossible to really manage this kind of coordination in a U.S.-Japan alliance context simply from the capitals themselves. I think the embassies need to get more involved because they have a chance to network with all these different players to some extent. So this brings me to one recommendation that I've been making recently, although I've been told it would never work because it's too overly structured and the role of the ambassador in each country is slightly different. But I like this idea of getting the embassies involved because they are quite naturally the most tight-knit interagency mechanisms or bodies within each government that are dedicated to a unified mission, that is the bilateral relationship. And all these different members are sitting in our capitals and in the other capitals in the embassies, which could be nominally led by the ambassador, who would meet maybe once or twice a year to coordinate a program of EPCC coordination teams. But the political and economic ministers in each embassy would lead these interagency task teams to support the 2+2 operations. So this is not to replace the METI and the Foreign Ministry and Commerce and State, but it's to give them more resources and more kind of on-the-ground presence. And then the embassies would have a counterpart or a point of contact in the National Security Council, National Security Secretariat, that would further assist in coordination. So this is just an idea. This is a highly structured idea, but something more flexible, less formal could be useful on this front. But I do believe that the EPCC could be a very important innovation for the alliance for the future to help deal with the kind of world that we're dealing with. The traditional 2+2 that we have now, the defense and foreign ministry connections, itself has evolved significantly over time. It was originally just the U.S. ambassador and the U.S. Forces Japan commander were the two counterparts for a defense agency chief and the foreign minister in the old days. But as the demands, as the alliance changed and we got involved in Middle East and Afghanistan and North Korea challenges, the foreign policy and security policy issues raised the level of the stakes for our alliance coordination and therefore raised the level of 2+2 coordination. I think eventually the EPCC will play a similar role in all these other areas of economic security in the alliance. And various stakeholders within the government will see that mechanism as a vehicle to get things done. And so they'll want to be active partners in that process. That's at least some of the thinking on that front. So if it's okay, maybe I'll stop there and allow us to have plenty of time for questions on that front.